Hey, it's Michael, and I have a question for you. When you vote, if you even vote at all, to what issues do you feel more connected? Local ballot issues and measures, or national elections? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the entire other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, to teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, how to listen and give space, so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans, our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. I'm sticking with and diving deeper into the political theme for another episode here on the follow-up question. Somewhat by chance and how the interviews kind of lined up, but also conveniently, because as of this episode going live, we're just about a week away from Election Day here in the United States. So I'm making a bit of an assumption that politics is likely, in some way, occupying your thoughts right now. My conversation on the last episode of the show with Ellie Zupnik focused on things like multi-party democracy, ranked choice voting, and proportional representation at the national level. In this episode, I'm bringing the field of vision down to the local level, where honestly I believe we're more likely to enact significant change. Because at the local level, we have more ability to affect said change. There's more within our control. We're closer to the problems and we're closer to the solutions. This mentality is at the heart of what my guest on this episode does for a living. Martine Carcasson started the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University, where, among many things, he helps train students to facilitate and run public meetings. As you'll hear Martine explain, democracy is hard, not impossible, but incredibly difficult, especially when we focus on issues that take us further away from our communities and the people around us. The idea of an engaged citizen, one that does their research, studies the issues at hand, and then votes based on a collection of this data, is unfortunately outdated at best and entirely unrealistic, Martine argues. Instead, Martine advocates for us to aspire to something he calls the wise collaborator, a mindset that plays out at the local level where real people can affect real change by coming together not as partisan enemies but as neighborly collaborators. At a time where there are so many conflict entrepreneurs making money off of our tendency to tribalize at the national level, Martine hopes to push back against these democracy-undermining actors by getting people to understand that we have shared problems and that it is these problems that are wicked, not the people. I read in something that you wrote that the ideal of the informed and engaged citizen that we were all kind of brought up to aspire to be, I read that you wrote that it was actually quite problematic. Why is that? Can you walk me through how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, part of that, I did this deep dive into like social psychology and brain science probably about 5 or 6 years ago to really understand, okay, what are we learning about how our brains work to really inform my practice, right? I'm designing events to help people have better conversations. So how can I kind of learn how the brain works to hopefully avoid tapping into the worst of human nature and tap into the best? And part of what I learned there is, that notion of being informed and engaged. Often the people that think that they're informed, they're not, they're often more misinformed, right? Because of confirmation bias and my sake bias and those type of things. So people don't naturally inform themselves very well. So then they probably engage rather badly, right? Yeah, they engage, with blinders on, only kind of seeing one perspective, assuming the worst of the other sides. I kind of made that argument in that paper of how do we develop a new ideal for the citizen, which I call the wise collaborator, which has a little bit of a different skill set, but I think one that would work a lot better to make kind of democracy work a little better.
It strikes me in what you just described, just how chaotic conversation has become. What factors do you point to say this is a major issue that we've got to deal with that is contributing to that chaos?
Yeah, in my classes, we talk about these kind of three key factors that make democracy really hard. And the first one is human nature, right? Unfortunately, our brains are not wired for deliberation or collaboration. We're much more wired for kind of polarization and for outrage and so forth. We want to see things through simple lens. We want to see things in terms of good versus evil and kind of our side versus their side. So that's the first aspect. And then the next two kind of take advantage of that. Our political system, particularly a two-party system, right, is almost designed to bring out the worst in human nature, right? It's a red team and a blue team kind of from the beginning. Winner-take-all elections, right, that really kind of incentivize you to mobilize your side, but you don't ever have to talk to the other side. And then the media on top of that, right, that unfortunately, thrive on conflict. I love Amanda Ripley's new term, conflict entrepreneurs, right? We have lots of people getting really rich or really popular by feeding these simple narratives, by taking advantage of human nature and giving it to us. So that's the work that we do. A lot of the work that a lot of people do in these different coalitions that we're a part of is, okay, how do we turn that tide, right? How do we, again, design processes to avoid triggering all that and actually tap into some of the best of human nature so we can actually deal with our shared problems better.
Martin, what has to be overcome? Just what you just said, to tap into the best of human nature. What are we overcoming there? What's the hurdle there that we're faced with?
Yeah, I think part of it is that need for certainty, right? That need to protect the decisions we've already made, to protect our team, to see things through narrow lens. Right? The good news is part of my research, a lot of my research was quite scary, right? Quite pessimistic, right? Of all these, the negative aspects of human nature are stronger. They're easier to trigger. They're much more evolved. But I also found some good news, right? There are some good, as a species, we're really good creative problem solvers when asked to be so. It's just sad how infrequently our political system asks us to be creative problem solver, right? Because if we just see the problem as, the other side, right? We see the problem as villains that we must get away from, we don't have to be creative. So that's the work that we do of shifting from this easy assumption of wicked people to putting the wickedness in the problem, that framework that we use. We think that really kind of works to shift us from this adversarial mode where our brains aren't working to a much more collaborative mode. Now, instead of face-to-face against each other, we're shoulder-to-shoulder working a problem. And then we start tapping into some really good aspects of human nature, that we are creative, that we are curious, that we are naturally empathetic, right? And all of a sudden we're having much more nuanced, complex conversations, but potentially enjoying them. And those certainly kind of lead to much more productive actions.
Martin, something you said there caught my attention. You said shifting the wickedness from people to the problem. Oh man, I'm kind of getting goosebumps on that. But how in the world do you accomplish something like that? What needs to take place to shift our thought from that person's wicked to this is a wicked problem that we can solve together?
Yeah. No, the work that we do, it talks about these significant components of what I call deliberative engagement. There's a lot of different words for it, and it requires a few different things. And so one thing, it does require kind of an impartial, trusted kind of resource. And that's certainly something I try to kind of build the Center for Public Deliberation to be. But there's other, part of the advice I give to people in local communities, that's where a lot of my work is you need to build these bridging institutions. You need to have these honest brokers of information, these conveners that are trusted. So that's the first ingredient. And then a lot of it is how you're framing the issue, right? How do you kind of set up, how are you talking about the issue? Most of our events have like discussion guides or backgrounders that we're purposely framing the issue, both to make sure people feel heard, they see their voice in there, but we're also reframing it away from that simple good versus evil and right, one side versus the other, to frame it. Typically almost all our processes are some form of, what should we do about X, right? Where X is, we is broad kind of notion of the community. X is a problem that most people agree is a problem. Certainly we disagree why it's a problem and disagree on what we should do about it, but there's some common ground of we're particularly, framing it as a way to kind of bring out the best people. And then the last kind of big agreement is how you engage people, right? So what we're able to do with my program is, 100 people show up instead of 100 people listening to experts on the stage or 100 people walking up to that microphone one at a time, which is horrible process design that brings out the worst in us. We can put them in 15 different tables and have my students at every table that are reacting to that discussion guide, working with some overall kind of ground rules. And it's all kind of designed to spark a very different conversation and to, trigger a very different parts of our brains.
So let's go there. You've mentioned your students. You've mentioned the Center for Public Deliberation that you've helped start at Colorado State University. Walk me through how that came to be. What is the origin story of the Center for Public Deliberation and your involvement in creating and building that program?
Yeah. So, basically, I'm a communication studies professor. So my research has always focused on how do we talk about tough issues. My initial academic training, this is late 90s or so, was actually in argumentation. So it's like a subfield, like how do people make arguments and how do you distinguish between a strong argument and a weak argument? And that does some of the traditional stuff in terms of fallacies and reasoning and so forth. But we have also looked broadly always as a field in terms of, the power of narrative and the power of emotional appeals and so forth, right? So I've always been interested in that, running classes. I used to teach a debate class all the time where people had to pick an issue and kind of both sides. And most of my early research was actually on American presidents. And I started getting more and more frustrated as I was going through my grad program because I would look at how American presidents are helping us, have tough conversations about tough issues. And I mainly found them, using tough issues as political footballs to win elections on both sides, right? So I finished my dissertation, which was focused on presidents. And when I got the job at CSU, I shifted my work from national politics to local. And I also shifted from being more of a critic, like analyzing other people's communication, to being much more of a practitioner, or one word used for people like me now is a pracademic, right? So I'm an academic, a tenured professor. I've got research responsibilities, but most of my work is practice in the community. So then I started playing in my classes of different ways of students kind of helping frame issues, the things I talked about earlier. How do we frame issues that are more productive? How do we talk to each other? How do we analyze issues that seeing issues as a wicked problem rather than assuming wicked people. And that was working well in class, but my students were like, well, yeah, this works in here, but we never see that out there, right? So then the CBD became an experiment, like initially it was just going to be an advanced class of like, all right, can we take some of these concepts into the community and help the community spark different conversations? So I started the CBD in 2016, so that's 12 years ago now. And originally I thought it would just be like a class, like we would have, one thing in the community. Maybe we can get 40 people to show up at the Hilton to have an interesting conversation. But I actually, I cold call. I was going for a grant that required, some people on an advisory board. So I created an advisory board. I called the city and the county and the school district and the League of Women Voters to tell them what I was doing. And just from those conversations, they were like, we have this meeting in a few weeks. You want to help us run it, right? So we would run a meeting for them and it would go really well. And they would call us back. And all of a sudden we were running some of these big kind of projects for the school district. Initially was a big partner. And it kind of took off from there, right? So really in 12 years, very rarely have we picked a topic. It has been the city, the county, the school district, the university, United Way coming to us saying, hey, can you help us have this conversation? To the point that about 6 years ago, we actually had to switch to a fee for service. It was just too big to be part of a class. So we had to, so we actually charge now primarily just to have a full-time staff person, right, to kind of help. But I do think it's a very hopeful story that, while we're wired for polarization and it's not natural to have these conversations, when you give people an alternative, they see the value of it. Right. And the best part of all my events is afterwards, as people are leaving, I like to stand by the door, like thanking them for their time, and they're exhausted. Their brains worked in ways they're not used to, but they know they did something important. And the reason it keeps on going is because they walk out to me and they say, we need to do this on this issue. Right. And they just see. So that's really, my goal, my belief is every college and university in the country should have a program like this. We've had expanded a lot. I've helped start lots of other ones. But how do we start building capacity in our local communities for this kind of work? So we can start showing people an alternative to, yelling past each other and actually, again, work on our shared problems more productively.
What are some of those issues that you and the Center for Public Deliberation and your students have helped to facilitate and foster those conversations? What are some of those issues?
Yeah, it kind of run across the gamut. Fort Collins in northern Colorado is big on green energy. So we've done a lot of environmental topics like, helping the city with their climate action plan and air quality and water, those type of things. We've also did a big, one of our best projects. We've been doing it for about 10 years. They use the metaphor silver tsunami, which is a horrible metaphor, but just the aging population, right? The baby boomers retiring, the percentage of our population over 65 or 80 is just kind of growing. So we worked with a few different partners to kind of ask the question, what kind of community do we want to have for our older residents? And that one actually ended up sparking a new organization that's now a full 501c3 with an executive director called the Partnership for Age-Friendly Communities. That's really, it's one of these bridging institutions. It's a trusted organization locally, focused on an issue. So an advocacy group in a way, but really open-minded on solutions, right? So their really goal is how do we have good conversations across public, private, nonprofit lines to kind of address these issues in an ongoing kind of way. So we've done a lot of work there. We've done a lot of work for campus, like we've helped the university with their strategic plan. We've done a lot of DEI kind of issues of kind of digging into that. We work with the local high schools. We have a public achievement program that we kind of run there. I know in the fall we're set to help the city with some budget processes. So yeah, it kind of runs across the gamut. And again, we don't have control of those, right? We're who's emailing us and say, hey, we'd like to help with this issue. The big issue I've been working on for the last year is we started a new project called the Northern Colorado Deliberative Journalism Project, which is a collaborative effort between the CPD, the journalism department here at CSU, political science, the languages department. We have a Spanish professor to help us reach out to that community, the local newspaper, local public access channel, local public radio, and some others that are growing to reimagine local journalism. How do we take on both the challenge of democracy and the polarization, but also the challenge of local journalism whose financial model has completely exploded in the last couple decades, and kind of rethink that and rebuild local journalism as this bridging institution that brings us together and sparks and helps us have those conversations. So that's really been the focus of my work for about the last year. That's been going pretty interestingly, I think.
Yeah, that's certainly near and dear to my heart, as you and I have discussed previously on a call. But I want to get back to something that you were just kind of walking through and just all those local projects, Martine. You said you made the transition from critiquing at the national level and following presidents and how they kind of lob an issue as a weapon to win an election. What have you noticed in narrowing the scope down to the local level? How do emotions change? How does involvement change when you can get somebody to take their eyes off of the horizon a little bit and just kind of refocus them to what's right in front of them, their community, their schools, their quality of life in the area where they live? What have you noticed? What happens when we start to narrow that focus down?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think part of it is what identities are triggered when you're trying to have these tough conversations. And obviously at the national level, the primary identities are going to be like Democrat or Republican, right? And that's a zero-sum two-party system, which, again, triggers a lot of bad things in our brain. At a local level, that's much less likely to happen. Right. And I think often we're actively working to make sure it doesn't. Right. Most local elections are not tied to Republican, Democrat. People tend to know who's the progressive and who's the conservative. Right. But I think trying to keep that out, trying to keep national issues away from our local city council is something that I've advocated in certain different ways. So how do we kind of make the primary identity is, hey, you're from Fort Collins, you're from Northern Colorado, right? You're from this community. So then we're starting at a place of a lot more common ground. Still certainly have differences, right? We don't want to, avoid those differences, but it gives us a lot more. And then I think, I mentioned earlier some of the good news about human nature, this natural empathy, right? We connect with people. Yes, it's much more natural to connect with people that look like you, right? So there's some landmines in there that we can work on, but real people having a conversation, listening to each other's stories, seeing kind of their nonverbals. That's powerful. That brings out some positive aspects of our human nature. And that's another one of the things I love for my work is hearing the students tell me those stories of people on two sides of the issue, right? I've had, events come up and some of the city staff person will walk up to me and go, uh-oh, those two people can't be in the same table, right? It's like the biggest advocate for one side, the other side, two kind of troublemakers. Thankfully, when that's really happened, it's always been one of my more experienced students. Like, I think they can handle it, right? And at the end, they get up and have a conversation and pass business cards, and because when we shift these issues from these exaggerations we have, these polarized kind of assumptions about the motives of the other side, but actually listen to each other. Still certainly have differences, right? I'm not looking for common ground. I'm not looking for consensus, but our differences are much more manageable than they often appear. So that's really the heart of a deliberative practice is let's get to the point of what we actually disagree with. And we probably have a lot that we can work on to try to figure out how to kind of manage that and how to kind of negotiate those differences in a much better way. And that's obviously a lot easier to do both at a local level because what you're tapping into, and then also in places where you can be face to face, right? We obviously had to go to Zoom for the last 2 years, like everyone in the world. So it actually worked better than I thought, right? We could still do, a bunch of people show up and then we put them into breakout groups with my students. But we're excited to primarily be going back to face because I think that magic of breaking bread together, having conversations, being there, getting a sense of the environment of the whole room. I think that helps really bring out, again, the best in people.
Yeah, it just struck me, Martin, that you mentioned topics that are widespread at the national level that really are, as to use your words, exaggerated. You mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. You mentioned the media and journalism. You've mentioned the environment and in these things that at a local level you're helping the city and these school districts and these students and these organizations tackle. It just strikes me that you're having success with it in a very different way than what the conversation is at the national level. And I'm curious, you mentioned it earlier, how does the wise collaborator fit into this? What does that wise collaborator look like that affords these conversations to happen at a local level?
Yeah, so part of the idea of the wise collaborator is, generally what I try to do with my events, right? I'm designing my event assuming most people coming in are somewhat already polarized, have an opinion already, and so forth, right? So I'm trying to create this, say 2-hour event that's going to transform them at least briefly to have a very different conversation to give us some really good information, right? But part of what happened is as the CPD, was 10 years and 12 years and so forth, we had lots of people that came in that had gone to lots of CPD events before, right? We actually have some groupies, right? We have some people that come to every CPD event because they enjoy it. So now we're getting people coming in who might not already have a pretty strong perspective on that topic, right? And those people can often be incredibly valuable to the conversation because they're not there to win an argument. They're not there to convince people they already have, this magic bullet. They're there to think. They're there to kind of come up with a better solution. So that's what actually started sparking this is, okay, most of my events are going to, most of my work is designing these events to try to depolarize and spark a better conversation. But man, the more people can walk in that are, what I say in the paper, that they're deliberation ready, right? That their brains have been rewired to deliberate, right? The better, right? So then that led me to, hey, what if we kind of rethink civic education and starting in elementary school, we actually start training kind of these skills, right? So I settled on the wise collaborator, the first part, wise, this goes back to Socrates and Aristotle and so forth, right? This is the rhetorical tradition of my background. Part of being wise is knowing what you don't know, right? Part of being wise is pushing back on the confirmation bias that seeks out certainty, right? And makes you more comfortable with uncertainty, right? So then that elevates our natural curiosity. We want people to be curious. They might have a really strong opinion, but we want always people to not think that they're right, right? That, it's possible that I might have some things wrong. I'm willing to learn, right? We talk about, keep your learning hat on, right? And then part of wisdom that we talked about is knowing how the brain works. I think there's a big inoculation effect. The more we teach people about these natural cognitive biases, how our brain is wired to be, the easier it is to control that. And so I kind of tell people, like, if there's a controversial issue that you're just so sure that you're right and everyone else just has to be an idiot, like, maybe an alarm bell should go off, right? Maybe this is your brain playing tricks on you. Maybe you're missing something, right? So that's the whys. And then the collaborator, we're not assuming people are just like not going to have a position, not to have their own kind of values. We're not asking people to check their interests at the door, right? We assume you're going to have some strong opinions, but we're hoping to kind of convince people the best way to get your way is to understand your neighbor's positions and what they want and what they care about, and then have the skill set to figure out, okay, how do we work together to kind of get what we all want in a way? So reframing, instead of an advocate, instead of an activist being the ideal, which activists have made great changes in the world, right? I teach a social movements class. I see the value of that, but too often that framing is very much us versus them. And, you're either with us or against us kind of thing, which makes it harder for us long-term to kind of work together, right? So what happens if we really kind of teach a collaborator as a significant option of, hey, I need to have the skill set of really listening, knowing how to ask good questions, figuring out what other people want. So then we can ultimately tap into that human creativity to, co-create the actions that really work to satisfy multiple values and, negotiate some of the tough tensions that are inherent to these issues.
Yeah, I love the term co-create. It means something different than compromise in my mind. And when you get somebody there to the co-creation stage, it just feels like there's an unlock there. And that's what I want to, that's where I want to go, Martine, is, okay, you've got the seasoned deliberators that are now coming to these events because they want to get involved in this way and they understand the process. For the person listening right now, who may be the skeptic, who may be that I'm sure I'm right on this issue type of person, how do you get them over that initial skepticism of this process? How do you even start, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I think, one thing that pops in my mind from that question is, when I talk about deliberation in this work, and, a lot of my work is helping communities think about how do you build capacity for this, right? And one quick thing I'll mention off what you just said is, when we build capacity, what we're trying to do ultimately is get to this point that one way to think about our community is we're working together to co-create, solutions, co-create the kind of community we want. So that's kind of like the ideal aim that we're going for ultimately. But then I also like to talk about that there's, some issues are clearly wicked problems in the sense that there's multiple underlining values on different sides. All the different sides have good values, have good motives, and in a process will help them realize that. And then we, how do we understand each other and develop these mutual relationships, right? And co-create kind of good solutions. So that's certain issues. Other issues, one side is has a lot more evidence, right? Clearly, it's on one side, and those are tougher issues for us to think about. Is in our partial role, right? But one thing I'm confident of is, there is a whole pragmatic nature to deliberation, right? Like one thing I talk about is, I mentioned earlier that we're trying to shift from this assumption of wicked people to wicked problems, and how does that change things? And I'm not saying that there's not wicked people. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying there's a lot fewer wicked people than we assume. Right. Half the country isn't evil. Right. Depending on what perspective you're in. And one thing I certainly know from the literature, from the psychology and brain science, is that very few people self-identify as wicked. Right. And telling someone that you think of they're wicked is very unlikely to make them less wicked. Right? So there's a whole pragmatic aspect of deliberation of, if we reframe issues, if we have better conversations, if we actually listen to each other, I think that's going to make it much more likely for the side that maybe doesn't have nearly as much evidence, or the values they're bringing to the table can't really compete with the values of the other side. I think that's going to much more likely lead to these aha moments and these shifts, right? People don't change their minds because facts are shoved in their face. People certainly don't change their mind because they're insulted or they're shamed, right? We know most of that backfires. Where people do change their minds is when they have a real conversation with someone that they have some respect from, right? And they're realizing like, we talk about these moments with my students of people like, that's why you think that way. That's where you're, when they're realizing instead of this assumption of negative motives, they're coming from a real place, right? I still disagree with you. I still think my argument's better than your argument, but now I understand where you're coming from. And now I can work with you, right? Because if I assume you just have bad motives, Monica Guzman does a nice job with this as well in her TED Talk, in her new book, right? We love to define people by what they're against. Right? Yeah. Like, I care about the environment. Therefore, if you disagree with me, you must hate the environment, but a real conversation, you realize, they care about some good stuff too. I think my stuff's more important than their stuff, but their stuff, so then now I can collaborate with that person. I can negotiate with that person. So that's the hopefulness is, some issues are truly wicked. Other issues, maybe this is much more of a I think this is going to end out moving the needle on the issues we care about more by changing our conversations. And the last thing I'll say here is, if an issue is really defined by bad faith actors and oppressors that are keeping people down, they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter, right? That makes it so much easier for status quo to stay, right? But if we start elevating our conversations, start having really conversations, I think it's going to be much more easier for us to kind of make the changes we need to make to get those kind of people outside of power.
I think I'm going to make the assumption that anyone just listening to what you just said, and that was so good, Martine, I'm going to make the assumption that anybody who heard what you just said about, people not changing their ways because they're called wicked or they're called names or they're shamed, I think we would all agree that we have never changed our minds because of any of that, and that would be true. So then in your research and in your experience, why is that so hard for us to assume of someone else? That are shaming them, that are blaming them, that are calling them wicked or evil. Where's the disconnect where, I've never changed my mind when somebody's done that stuff to me, but I'm going to turn around and do it to someone else and assume that it will work? Where's the disconnect there?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I guess one thing is because we probably don't, empathy is based on seeing ourselves in them. Right. But if we have such a caricature of them, right, that we don't see ourselves in them, right? Like I've never thought such horrible things, right? So people would never kind of say those things. The other thing is, I've already talked a lot about our brains. Our brains want simple, but then also from that, we tend to hang around like-minded people, right? If I post something on my Facebook that makes fun of the other side, I get a whole bunch of likes, right? A whole bunch of people that, So whenever we're shaming the other side, we get a lot of kind of social, we get a lot of dopamine hits, right? We get a lot of, whereas on the opposite side, if we're defending the other side or if we're trying to kind of be nuanced, those posts tend to fall flat a little bit, right? So much of our, who's around us, who we're talking to, who we're getting our information from is kind of based on our team, right? That when we don't really see the consequences of that, right? We only see the positive consequences of our side cheering us, right? Saying, yeah, you showed them, right?
Yeah, I'll say it is frustrating for me. And the thing I'm trying to do here to post on social media about finding the common ground and asking questions and discovering empathy and seeing how little traction it can get on social media or how much harder it is to gain traction with that message versus just the shaming, the blaming, the name calling. That stuff blows up in an instant. I mean, it's immediate. Jumping back to the wise collaborator then. You mentioned a bunch of these characteristics of what it means to be wise and what it means to be collaborative. How can we work on those things by ourselves, or is it something where we have to force ourselves into these situations like the ones that you put on. Is there anything we can do first before we jump into these, or anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, no, great. I talk a lot about it. It has to be kind of a two-step process, right? Because I think, if an individual person decides, you know what, I'm going to be more collaborative. I'm going to, check my perspectives and not make assumptions and learn how to ask good questions. All that stuff is good, right? But if the broader culture stays hyper partisan, hyper polarized, right, that person's going to get run over, right? If I'm having a conflict with someone and I'm willing to listen to them and I'm willing to concede, and part of it is our brains are really good at seeing the upside of our perspective and the downside of the opposing perspective, right? So part of your individual skill set of becoming wise is to recognize, you know what, there's a downside to my perspective. There's some trade-offs, right? There's some, and there's some upside to the other. Now you can still certainly believe that, hey, the balance of upside and downside on my side is better than the other side. So you don't have to change your mind. You don't have to be wishy-washy, right? But you're just recognizing, hey, there's not too many magic bullets out there, right? But the problem is if we just individually, have some people kind of change strategically in a hyper-partisan environment, that's not going to be very successful, right? So we have to simultaneously change how people think and kind of engage and give them a different skill set, but then also work to change how we engage, to change the broader engagement processes. Now, changing the broader engagement processes at the national level, that ain't going to be easy, right? Lee Drutman's work is great here. There's some really good ideas about, partly, somehow getting away from a two-party system. That I don't study that stuff enough to kind of get into that too much, right? I'll let other people that focus on how do we change some of these national things. My focus is, and I've had some success and I believe it works, right? At a local community, yes, you can build capacity to have the kind of conversations we need to have and kind of change that dynamic somewhat. I mean, I can tell you, particularly at a CPD event, if someone comes in and is sure that they're right, and just wants it, they kind of look foolish, right? They're like, this is not what we're doing here, right? Whereas most public processes, if it's a one-time in the microphone, right, it incentivizes someone walking up and just saying, I'm right and all of y'all are wrong kind of thing, right? So we're rewarding that kind of behavior. So yeah, I think it's a two-step process. We need to change from the individual skill set, what students are kind of learning in school about how to solve problems, but then we also have to be working together, the harder work of how do we change our structures, how do we engage people and build that capacity as well. And that's where I think we'll start seeing the needle moving more in our communities.
Do you think it flows the other way? Do you think it flows out from the events that you host and facilitate and your students are helping to facilitate? Does that carry over into people's everyday lives, do you think? Have you seen that carry over?
No, I've certainly heard. I've heard more stories. We've been doing this for 16 years. So I've got a lot of alumni out in the world. I love hearing from my alumni of how, and they've been trained as facilitators. Some of them, work as facilitators. We've had a few kind of start their own business and that kind of stuff, but most of them not, right? Most of them have different jobs. But come and tell me how often, they facilitate, how often they're using the skill set of asking good questions, and how often kind of thinking in terms of wicked problems and really trying to identify the underlying values that different people kind of care about. So I would assume kind of participants kind of the same thing, right? And that's part of the repeat offend, the people that come back to CPD events, right? The first one they showed up to is because they had a pretty strong opinion about something, right? Yeah. But then hopefully through that process, they realize like, oh, this isn't as simple. The people I disagree with are coming from a good place. So what I'm hoping is the next time they start getting angry about an issue, they stop and they're like, maybe this was like that other one, right? Maybe I should kind of think about what else is going. And that's part of the evolution of the CPD. First 5 years, we were running these individual events, right? Then it got to be these projects that were often kind of multiple events, right? More of a long-term kind of conversation, but still kind of event focused. And then probably about 10 years in, we started shifting more to a systems model, right? To think of Northern Colorado as a system. Our events are one node in that system, but our overall goal is to elevate the conversations we have in Northern Colorado to build capacity for the kind of conversation we need to have. So that's where like the journalism project comes out, right? Hey, how can the local newspaper be a deliberative resource, right? How can we use that? They actually had killed their opinion page about 5 years ago or so. They brought it back with this project, right?
Oh, really?
them with it. And we're actually going to have a dedicated graduate journalism class in the fall that will be helping with it, of like, how do we experiment and see if we can have an online forum about local issues actually be positive examples of communication, rather than just people kind of, flaming and kind of talking past each other and so forth. Working more with a library, so how do we build more deliberative capacity in lots of different ways? And that's the model that we're trying to kind of figure out, and then, obviously try to help that spread, and I think the more people see this, like I said earlier, more people are exposed to these different kind of conversations, the more they'll ask for it, the more they'll push back on this ridiculous talking past each other two-party system, right? So that's the ultimate hope is, as more and more cities across the country and across the world start building these kind of capacities, they'll demand it more of their state politics, and eventually, hopefully, national politics, and then also, hopefully, the leaders. The municipal leaders of today might be the state leaders. So then, do we have a different kind of politician making their way up the ladder? That's kind of playing off a different model.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hopefully, I guess, the opposite of the trickle down effect, maybe a little bit of trickling up here. I celebrated when you said that the newspaper got rid of their opinion page. That's actually something I've advocated for myself in ways to rebuild media trust. It's interesting that you said that the newspaper was bringing it back. Walk me through that deliberative process, I guess. What spurred not only the takeaway of the opinion page? I can make some guesses there, but what is the reason for wanting to bring it back?
Yeah, so the takeaway, our local paper here, the Coloradan, is a Gannett paper, right? So Gannett, does metrics, right? So part of it was with all newspapers losing resources and so forth and cutting staff, it took a lot of staff time to keep it going, and people weren't clicking those articles that much, right? So they decided, hey, we're not going to do that anymore. And that actually kind of started me down this road, because two things that they did, right? They had a community editorial board, which actually I didn't know that was pretty rare, right? Most editorial boards for newspapers is just an internal editorial board, but this is a community board. I think people would serve for like 2 years, like 8 people. They try to have some diversity there, right? Someone from the university, someone from the business community, those type of things. And they would meet a couple times a week to talk about local issues. And then on Sunday, they would have an editorial, which typically was pretty thoughtful. Right. They would actually bring me in there every once in a while, not all the time, to kind of give them training on wicked problems and how to frame things. And, so I always saw that as a positive kind of impact on local issues. And they had letters to the editor and other kind of, opinions, things that, no, those were hit and miss. Right. But it was a chance for people to express opinions. Right. And first step is people have a chance to talk about local issues. Bringing it back, what they do now, and this is an ongoing experiment. We just started it. It started back, I think, maybe late April or so. But every week on Friday, they post 2 questions. They're always local issues, right? They post 2 questions online, and then it's in the Sunday kind of actual hard copy paper. And then all week long, they collect responses to it, right? So individual opinion, so forth, which is not great, right? But we it's the raw data we need. And then the following week, they post 2 new questions. And they kind of post an article primarily written by Coloradan. We've helped them with that a little bit. We'll help them a lot more in the fall with this new journalism class, where we analyze what we heard, right? Like, hey, here are the different perspectives that we heard. And we're trying to figure out how to do that well in terms of, hey, how do we bring out some fact questions that maybe we can research? And that's part of what the just journalism class will do, right, is provide additional capacity for a local paper to kind of track things down, right? If people are saying something we're not sure is right, we can actually have more boots on the ground, journalists learning to be journalists that can kind of do that groundwork. But then also do some of the underlining value analysis that we tend to do at the CPD. Right. Here are the different perspectives people are coming, and here's the key tensions that we need to struggle with. Right. So it's taking it and hopefully taking it to the next level. That it's not just here's a whole big individual collection of opinions, people talking past each other and potentially saying things that are wrong. The next level is, okay, here's how we're understanding the issue. Maybe that launches some other kind of research into that. Maybe that launches some kind of follow-up questions. But the big part is keeping it local, right? Because one of the reasons that we're so polarized, with the internet, most of our news is Fox News or CNN or presidents or, so most of the news we get about issues is very, very politicized and very, very partisan, right? Because we're not getting our news from the local paper, which, wasn't framed that way. So part of what we're trying to do is how do we get people back to, local news is part of your news appetite. So it's, likely to be much less kind of polarized in a sense. The problem, of course, is national news is free and, local news you might have to pay for, right? And why pay for something if you're getting it free? So that's part of the broader thing that we're working on with the project is how do we reimagine local journalism? Part of that is reimagining the financial model. So how do we, find other ways of funding local journalism so that they're not so reliant on subscribers, so we can get that information to everybody that you don't have to, either convince people to pay for it, that it's, it's necessary for a community to have good journalism, or find alternative ways to get it paid for. But how do we revitalize local journalism?
I love it. I love it, Martin. And I'm going to be following that for sure. Just because it's, like I said, it's near and dear to my heart as a former practicing journalist and just at the local level. And you're right. I mean, and that's one of my final questions here as we begin to wrap this up is, you mentioned it. It's local journalism. These are local issues that folks are coming together to solve. You mentioned earlier during the pandemic, obviously you had to go to Zoom and do things remotely, and the challenges of the force-fed information that we're seeing at a national level that's free and constantly in our news feeds. How important is it that we make the concerted effort to do this kind of stuff in person, face to face with each other, where we see and read body language, we hear inflection in a little bit different way, we sense the tension in the room? How important is it that we make this effort to get in front of other people more often?
Yeah, no, I mean, before Zoom, I remember giving a talk at ICMA, the International City County Managers Association, and a lot of the questions after the talk was about online and that forth, and I made a strong argument there of like, you know what, there's some cool online tools, let's kind of improve them, and they can be useful, but I think democracy is going to require real people talking to each other, right? And then Zoom, then COVID happened. We went to Zoom. It went better than I thought, right? It took a little bit longer for groups to gel. The facilitation is a little bit harder. For people that talk too much, it's easier for them to dominate on Zoom, right? Because it's harder to kind of step in, right? You can't lean in and they realize you want to talk. So there's some challenges. But I was actually thinking, this is a better alternative than I thought, right? And then we had, earlier, like February or so, we had our first event in person in 2 years. And by that time, I didn't have a single student that did in-person events, right? Because, I typically have students for a year, maybe a couple years. But, and I remember the debrief after that event, my students were just like, that was awesome, right? Like the actual in-person event, real people talking to each other was such a different experience for them. Right.
Yeah.
It was so much of a different thing of real people so I'm going back now going, real people talking to each other. The other thing I'll quickly say here, I'm forgetting the author's name. I think it's Tinge or something like that research on kind of the iPhone generation, right? And some of the problems from that. Jonathan Haidt's kind of done a lot of work on here too. But there is an argument out there that we're actually starting to lose our natural kind of human empathy. Right. And one of the arguments I was set forth in this book was this notion that younger generations tend to have their toughest conversation by text, right? Because you can kind of work on the message and you can edit it before you send it. And so, instead of on the fly, like how do people react, so bad news or good news or whatever, you're kind of sending it out by text. And what that happens then is I'm not seeing people's reaction, right? I don't see their facial expressions. I don't see their emotions, and literally my brain is not making these new synapses about the what I said and the impacts of that. Right. So that is part of this notion of the art of conversation that we've lost in some ways. I think we've got a vested interest in our communities to reteach that. That's a skill set we need. We need to be able to talk to each other, real people, kind of on the fly. It goes back to what I said earlier, that people don't change their mind because of information or because you sent them a Facebook video to watch or because you insult them. They change their mind when they have genuine conversations with people that they trust. Part of my job, part of what I'm trying to convince city leaders to do of their job is how do you create opportunities for people that have different perspectives to come together in a place where they can, have these kind of conversations, which are, you need facilitate, you need lots of things. Our brains aren't wired. Don't just throw people in a room and say, hey, talk about abortion, right? No, you need these different components. You need these things that we're learning from lots of different fields. But having those kind of conversations, and those are going to kind of make those connections, develop that mutual understanding, kind of rebuild that trust, so we can kind of work on these things.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Martin, what is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I don't know if I want this question, but probably it's a necessary question, right? Because we talked a lot about shifting from national to local and so forth, and certainly part of that was my move for my own mental health, right? I was getting my PhD, and I was publishing a lot of papers about how badly we talked about issues, and that didn't seem like a fun career, right? So I shifted from national to local because A, because I wanted to involve students, and B, because I needed a little bit more optimism, right? But probably what I should also admit is, there's some trade-offs there, right? There's some issues that I remember we did a big project on healthcare kind of early on, and there was part of me that was thinking, is this project just making a bad system work good enough so people don't change? So there's some issues that have to be national, right? So yes, I truly believe in the kind of build from the bottom up. The more and more we have cities and communities doing this, the better. But there's also a realization that, we can't just abandon national issues, right? Some issues have to be at the national level. So we have to take on that kind of challenge as well.
I appreciate the context there, Martin. That's important, and I'm glad we ended it with that. So I will link up the Center for Public Deliberation in the show notes so people can check out the work that you and your students are doing there. Anywhere else that you would like me to direct folks to follow you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on Twitter. So it's just at @Carcasson with my last name. Luckily, there are not too many people with my last name, so that's an easy one. I also on Facebook I have a Facebook blog kind of thing called the Wicked Problems Mindset. That I kind of post ideas and kind of play with on there. You can direct people, and then the Deliberative Journalism Project also has kind of a Twitter if people are particularly kind of familiar with that. But we don't have too much kind of a strong web presence with the Deliberative Journalism Project quite yet. But that's one of the things the journalism class in the fall is going to be kind of putting that all together. But we've done a few webinars. We had some big meetings last year that we posted on YouTube, kind of the introduction, the explanation of what we're trying to do. So if people are particularly interested in that, you'll be able to find that through either my Twitter or we call it NOCO DJP, I think is the Twitter handle for that one.
Beautiful. I will make sure all that is linked up.
Yeah, and the CPD website has lots of has links to a lot of my articles and that kind of stuff. Our article on the Wise Collaborator that we kind of talked about. Yeah. Article on I talk about process matters, that whole aspect of how do we avoid triggering the worst of human nature and tap into the best. So happy and wicked problems. So a lot of writings on those type of things.
Wonderful. I'm so glad we connected. Thank you so much. This has been great. And, let's definitely keep in touch because you're working on an important problem here, man. So I appreciate you and the work that you do.
Yeah, very much appreciate the conversation.
So many thanks to Martin Carcasson for sharing his story and perspective and expertise on the show this episode. Please do me and Martin a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation today. Share this episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Martin that I have on each and every episode, subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.